Welcome back. The European Union has announced that it is doubling its financial contribution to a security force mounted by the 5 countries of the Sahel region: Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania and Niger. The EU's foreign policy chief, Federica Mogherini, promised the extra $61 million at the start of an international donor conference in Brussels, attended by 50 nations.
At a conference of about 50 countries, including the United States, Japan and Norway, countries pledged 414 million euros for the G5 Sahel force, made up of troops from Mali, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso and Mauritania. The European Union, which believes training local forces will avoid risking the lives of its own combat troops, was one of the biggest donors, doubling its contribution to 116 million euros. It paves the way to make the force fully operational later this year.
The most important number, which I'm happy to share with you today, is the sum we secured, totaling 414 million euros. I repeat, 414 million euros. It goes beyond initial expectations thanks to an enormous mobilization, not only of the European Union and its member states, but also of other international partners.
EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini stressed that promises had to be followed through quickly to reach troops, while African leaders say the money so far would only cover the first year of operations. We know. The results were announced. The conference was a real success. But unfortunately, the resources announced cover costs only for the first year of operations of the G5 Sahel Joint Forces. It's not certain that confrontations between US and the terrorists end in a year. Welcoming the Sahel Plan, French President Emmanuel Macron praises France's two-pronged approach to tackling migration by increasing security, while simultaneously encouraging development in the West African region. Mr. Macron says France, the region's former colonial power, with 4,000 troops in the region, will continue its own offensive alongside the G5 Sahel force.
Amnesty International's annual report, published on Thursday, February 22, says there is a deepening human rights crisis in West and Central Africa in 2017. It highlights measures governments have taken to silence protest in Togo, Guinea, Ethiopia and Kenya, using force and arbitrary arrests.
Amnesty International has expressed concern over what it says are severe right violations in some parts of Africa.
Repression that's come about through government responses to protests, which are themselves driven by grievances, socioeconomic grievances, the right to health, the right to education, the right to speak up, the right to participate in society, and the repression that we've seen there. And then that hope, people coming out into the streets in increasing numbers, people taking a stand, and often at great risk.
In Togo, Amnesty says at least 11 people, including 3 children and 2 members of the armed forces, were killed during protests violently repressed by the security forces. In Guinea, it says at least 18 people were killed and dozens injured during demonstrations. For the Central African Republic, the report notes that thousands of civilians have been killed and forced to flee because of armed conflict and what they describe as large-scale human rights violations and abuses, with armed groups carrying out a range of abuses. The report also condemns Cameroon security forces for a crackdown on Anglophones in north and southwest Cameroon, where activists were arrested, and a massive crackdown forced thousands to flee to neighboring Nigeria. They also point the finger at Sierra Leone's government for failing to implement housing and land policies that they say could have avoided a mudslide in 2017 that killed at least 500 people. In Kenya, Amnesty International accuses the police of using excessive force against opposition protesters following the elections, leaving dozens dead. They added that the ruling party made statements threatening the independence of the judiciary after the Supreme Court annulled the election results.
I think one of the lessons going forward is how do we protect democratic freedoms, the right of association, the right to expression, the right to assembly, in a manner that does not lead to the kind of deaths that we saw undocumented as Amnesty and the Human Rights Watch last year. But also, you know, as the inquest for baby Pendo rolls out in Kisumu as we speak, that we do not see month-old children, infants, really at the prey and the end of the violence of our police forces.
Meanwhile, Amnesty International says arbitrary detention continues in Ethiopia. Hundreds of people were detained under the anti-terrorism proclamation, and detainees were held in excess of 4 months, the maximum period allowed under the law for pre-trial detention.
Governments are stuck in the difficult position of making choices between repression and reform. Some are taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But it's really only by addressing these real issues, these real grievances, that the region will be able to stabilise and foster sustainable development.
Hundreds of political activists, dissenters and peaceful protesters faced unfair trials on charges brought under the ATP law. The trials were marked by prolonged pre-trial detention, undue delays and persistent complaints of torture and other ill treatment.
Meanwhile, UN investigators say they have identified more than 40 South Sudanese military officers who may be responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, this is a sharp departure from previous UN reports that documented crimes, but not the perpetrators. All-rich South Sudan gained independence from neighboring Sudan in 2011, but slid into civil war in December 2013. More than 4 million people, a third of the population, have been uprooted by the violence.
There are victims that we've spoken to and who have given testimony to us who have been mutilated, gang raped, often by up to a dozen men, if not more. And sometimes relatives were first forced to watch, sometimes children were forced to watch, sometimes children were forced to engage in the rape themselves and even kill. There have been massive violations across the country of the right to food, the right to education, and millions driven from their homes. We will be handing over not just the report to the Human Rights Council, but a confidential dossier with the names of those that we think should be investigated by the future prosecutor of this hybrid court. And indeed, the crimes that have been committed are crimes under international law and could be prosecuted even in other countries outside of South Sudan if the perpetrators were found there.
In Europe, EU Council President Donald Tusk says that Britain's stance regarding its post-Brexit relationship with the European Union are pure illusion. The European Council President told a news conference in Brussels last Friday that the UK is still trying to cherry-pick its future relationship with the EU. The British Prime Minister Theresa May is set to deliver a key speech setting out British ambitions this Friday.
If the media reports are correct, I am afraid that the UK position today is based on pure illusion. It looks like the cake philosophy is still alive. From the very start, it has been a key principle of the EU27 that there can be no cherry picking and no single market a la carte.
And that's Diplomatic Channel. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Temitope Fagbemi.